Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm so disappointed that this government isn't willing to consider sober second thought, having put forward such a scandalous abuse of omnibus budget bills as is found in Bill C-4. What we have in Bill C-4, Mr. Speaker, which is titled the Affordability Act, and there are many measures that most of the measures are about affordability. But magically, Mr. Speaker, there's this bizarre inclusion of amendments to the Elections Act. C'est donc partie 4 dans le...
So that is Part 4 of Bill C-4, and that is where we find the following. Amendments to the Elections Act. The cost, is that affordability? Is that cost of living? Very bizarre.
That we find in Part 4 of Bill C-4, which is the Affordability Act, unaccountably changes to the Elections Act. The content of those changes is, I will use the word scandalous again. Canadians will be scandalized, and it's unfortunate that the way of going in this Parliament has been for things to be passed so quickly, people don't even know what they've carried, what they've passed. Part 4 of Bill C-4 is all about one thing: removing any thought that there's any requirement on the part of any federal political party in this country to protect the personal private information of Canadians. So the bill is a bit of overkill, one might say. At one point in Part 4 of Bill C-4, it says, well, any of the provisions for protection of privacy are, quote unquote, deemed never to have come into force and are repealed. Well, if they were deemed never to have come into force, I suppose it's a bit of overkill to also make sure they're repealed. But wait, it gets worse. Then the bill says, this Part 4 of Bill C-4, this will come into force in the year 2000. I remember the day this bill was tabled in June, taking around the hard copy of Bill C-4 to various friends on this side of the House in the Liberal Party, saying, look there, why does this bill have to come into force in the year 2000? And to a person, people would say, well, it must be a typo. No. That is not a typo, my friend. That is a time machine. I've never seen that before in this place. That a bill in the future tense will come into force 26 years ago. Now, ce n'est pas extraordinaire.
There's nothing extraordinary about me not having seen something like this.
Yes, but pour le moment, c'est une...
But that said, it's an odd part.
Looked at it and said, why do we have buried in this Affordability Act amendments to the Elections Act? And it's all well and good for the preamble the Speaker just read, that the government says we're sending this back to the Senate. They have no business. Let's slap them on the wrist for thinking that they can presume to tell anybody in this place about the Elections Act. But the government had this coming and well overdue to start looking at sections in omnibus bills. I think it's scandalous that we didn't. I know a lot of senators were disturbed by Bill C-12. They looked at C-12 and they looked at it in committee and they said, this hasn't been properly studied and this is going to abuse the rights of refugees. But they held back. They thought, we don't want to, the government doesn't want to accept our amendments, so we won't make amendments. We'll put on the record that a subcommittee is concerned about this. But for the Senate to make amendments was tough because the pressure was on them not to make amendments. In fact, the leader of the government in the Senate went so far as to misstate two other senators and claim that Bill C-4 had been carried unanimously in this place. I noticed they were careful in that preamble we just heard to say unanimous support from recognized parties. So again, the Liberals, the Conservatives, and the Bloc were happy to carry this unanimously. My objections were recorded on the record, even in so-called unanimous consent motion. It says, noting the opposition of the member for Saanich Gulf Islands. So why do I dig in my heels? Why do I say hooray for the senators who've put forward some common sense amendments? And what is wrong with this government that they won't accept the Senate amendments? If you haven't looked at the Senate amendments, again, standing by what I've said, is extraordinary that the government of Canada would say, we're bringing into effect a bill that took effect 26 years ago. What kind of offense has the Liberal Party committed that in the last 26 years that requires a time machine to say the laws that we might have had to protect personal information of Canadians didn't ever exist, was never carried, and on top of that, now that we're saying they never existed, that takes effect in the year 2000. The Senate amendment just says, look, 3 years from when C-4 will take effect, 3 years from now, the government must have come up with a way of protecting the personal and private information of Canadians held by federal political parties. Now, we know that on the record, and this was just not that long ago, so I'll cite the source. This was an iPolitics news story of March 3rd of this year, where the leader of the government in this House, and of course I won't say his name, but we know, he was quoted in an iPolitics story as saying, I can assure you that, and he cites that he was former national director of the Liberal Party, for our part, and I assume all parties, follow the same basic standard, we essentially comply with PIPEDA, referring to the acronym for the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. Now, there's currently a court case going on in British Columbia because the Privacy Commissioner for British Columbia has said that as a matter of law, provincial political parties in British Columbia have to abide by protection of privacy information for Canadians. We know that there was a study before the Ethics Committee back in 2018. The study was titled Breach of Personal Information Involving Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, where we know that that particular case study should make us as parliamentarians and as people who believe in democracy deeply, deeply concerned that personal and private information of Canadians can be misused in the hands of those who develop systems like Cambridge Analytica did, systems to target, use algorithms, distort, and deliver information which is misinformation directed to particular people who are likely to believe, pre-inclined, predisposed to believe that misinformation. So in that case, in that study, they pointed to the need to protect the personal information of Canadians held by federal political parties. Now, I won't disagree with the government for 1 minute. It would be far better not to bury in an omnibus bill on affordability, taking away the rights to personal private information of Canadians held by federal political parties. It would be far better to be open about it and say, guess what? We're going to amend the Elections Act. We're going to talk about personal and private information of Canadians. I think the government should be ashamed. Every Liberal, every floor crosser who joins this gang should be ashamed of being associated with a piece of subterfuge as vile as saying this is an act on affordability, don't look over there at Part 4, it's nothing to do with you, it's something we're doing about privacy information, and we're making sure it took effect 26 years ago. If they had nothing to be ashamed of, why not bring forward a bill that on its own is about the Elections Act, that on its own is to update, that on its own says clearly to Canadians, what do you want us to do with your personal and private information, those of us who are federal political parties? We say on the record, and certainly the Green Party wants to see, and we try very hard to abide by all the personal and private information protections as if the law already applied to us clearly. We will continue to do so. But this is an abomination that today, with a very reasonable amendment from the Senate, that 3 years from now, once this bill is passed, we'll have a better plan of action. And then the government's motion today said, oh, we're planning to bring forward something soon. Sooner than 3 years from now? How can you possibly then, not you, Madam Speaker, but how can the government possibly object to an amendment from the Senate that says get your act in order within the next 3 years? Madam Speaker, I know my time is just about up, but we should, in this place, absolutely refuse to accept the government advice on this, that we reject Senate amendments. If there was ever a time for sober second thought, it's now. Because this is embarrassing, that we pass a law that says, and all of the recognized parties, conservatives, liberals, and bloc, you're all okay with passing a law now that turns the clock back 26 years? Come on. This is embarrassing. Please accept the Senate amendments. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? Okay, are we ready for...